Hey guys, good morning for another day of psychology. We're going to continue talking about things that get in the way of us thinking clearly and us solving problems, and the fact that we're, essentially pretty illogical. And one of my favorite terms in this unit is called framing. And framing is how an issue is posed and how it completely changes people's thinking about it and their logic and the entire cognitive process just of how an idea is posed. So that's the definition of framing is the way an issue is posed changes people's decisions, changes people's judgments about that idea. Also, excuse the fact that my hair is still wet. I just got out of the shower. Anywho, um, but I did have time for my makeup, so there you go. So here is the classic example of framing. Um, Doctors are more likely to say, 90% of the population is saved with this medicine. They're rarely going to go with the same information of saying 10% of the population that receives this medicine will die despite getting it. Basically, a 10% failure rate. They're not going to pose that idea out. They're going to focus on the saving part because even though it's the same information logically, it changes how people think about it. Same thing with how like certain products are described in advertising and things like that at the grocery store. What's the best way to market ground beef? Are they going to say 75% lean or 25% fat? They're going to stick with the lean part, even though it's the same information. Okay, one of my favorite stories about framing. Oh, and I'm going to get to that in just a second. But of my favorite stories. But if anyone remembers this scene from Friends, this is when Rachel tells Ross that she's pregnant, and he's like, but we used a condom, and she's like, yeah, but they only work like 95% of the time, and he's like, well, they should put that on the box. And she's like, they do put that on the box. And he's like, they should put that in big, bold letters because that basically means that 5% of the time they don't work. And you're going to be putting yourself at risk of an unwanted pregnancy or a sexually transmitted disease or both. And, saying that, a 5% failure rate would probably, people would choose other forms of birth control that has something less than a 5% failure rate, but they're not going to focus on that. They're going to focus on 95% success because that sounds a whole lot better. But one of my favorite stories about framing is there's a guy who I love. His name is Richard Thaler. This is my little notes for him at the side. He is a professor of economics, and he actually kind of invented a study of economics that combines economics and psychology, and it's kind of new. It's called behavioral economics. So it combines psychology and economics into one single study. If I was going to school today, like if I was doing undergraduate today, that's what I would be doing because it's fascinating. But Richard Thaler, he's a professor, and he would give pretty hard tests to his students. And the first test he gave, the average was a 72 out of 100, and people complained. All of the students were like, "This is not fair." They complained, and with too many complaints, professors can get in trouble. So he's like, "Okay." I'm not going to make my test easier, and I don't want to give a bigger curve because 72% average is not that bad. So what did he do? Instead of changing the difficulty of his test, or instead of changing the curve, he changed it how many points the test was worth. Instead of being out of 100, he made it out of 137, which is much harder to do the math in your head. So when people got a 96 out of 137, the average was just the same. In fact, the next test he took, he said his average was exactly the same as his first test. But now that he framed it differently, instead of 72 out of 100, people were getting 96s out of 137. Well, if they were doing the math, they would have realized that's the same percentage correct and the same percentage incorrect. But it didn't matter. He got no complaints on his test from then on. He says he's been doing that since the very first test, and he's gotten 0 complaints, and people are on average happy with their scores and happy with their grade. even though it's the same. It's because he framed it differently. 96 sounds a whole lot better than a 72, but out of different denominators, those are different scores. So it's just the way people frame a scenario. I found this online yesterday as well, and I read this in a book, but I wanted to get the numbers right. It is the framing effect. I don't know if you can hear this, but the dog is like barking like mad crazy right now. Okay, let me scroll to where I wanted to get it right. Okay. There was a study where participants had to choose between 2 treatments for 600 people who contracted a fatal disease. So 600 people have a fatal disease, and they had to choose between treatment A and treatment B. Treatment A would result in 400 deaths immediately. And treatment B had a 33% chance that no one would die, but a 66% chance that everyone would die. Okay, this was done by either framing, a positive framing of how many people would live, or a negative framing of how many people would die. Treatment A received the most support. 72% of people picked treatment A, saying that it should result in, treatment A would result in 400 deaths out of 600 people. But very few people, only 22%, actually chose treatment B, which framed saving 200 lives. I'm reading that wrong. Sorry. It says treatment A received a majority of support when it was framing of how to save lives, but it dropped significantly when framed of losing 400 lives. So it says almost 100% of students. Okay, that goes on to something else. I don't want to go into another example. I think we have enough examples. But my favorite one still is that Richard Thaler, a little experiment that he kind of did on his students. So just in how an idea is posed completely changes people's reaction, their judgment, and their feeling and cognition about the whole event. Okay, there's another problem in our thinking. I was waiting for it to pop up, and it's called belief bias. This is different than we talked about yesterday. What were we talking about yesterday? We were talking about confirmation bias. When you search for things that already confirm your own bias, this is different. This is belief bias. This is when our already biases, our already beliefs and feelings about things make us think illogically. We can't see illogical statements because of our own belief system. Okay, like this. It says a tendency for one's pre-existing beliefs to distort logical reasoning. So here is a premise. Premise 1. So let's say that in this premise, Democrats support free speech and dictators are not Democrats. It's the second premise. So can we, using logic, using mathematical formulas, can we conclude that dictators do not support free speech? It feels like that sounds right. If Democrats support free speech and dictators are not Democrats, dictators, by definition, it feels like they shouldn't support free speech, right? Because that makes sense. That sounds logically, but it's not. That is an illogical statement because here's the exact same premise with the same kind of formula, but without any feeling. Premise 1, robins have feathers. Premise 2, chickens are not robins. Conclusion, chickens do not have feathers. We see that that's wrong. We see that that's an illogical conclusion, but it's the exact same one, as exact same formula and setup as the first one. But the first one sounded right because of our own pre-existing beliefs and negative feelings about dictators. But this whole chickens have feathers, we realize that's flawed. That's not right at all. Well, that same conclusion is down here as over here, and they're both illogical. But if you feel like this one on the left is more logical, that's your own bias. That's your own belief bias. Okay, and here's our last one today. Belief perseverance. Ugh. Belief perseverance is when you have been proven wrong after your initial conceptions have been discredited. You still believe it. Even though you've been proven wrong you still cling on to that belief. And so, you look at this guy who's the company A, is the share price is falling, and he's like, it's a good investment. Well, no, it's not. There are people that don't believe in dinosaurs. I actually know someone pretty well doesn't believe in dinosaurs, even though there's proof that dinosaurs have existed. They still don't believe it. The fact that there are flat earthers today in 2020, how, I don't understand. Belief perseverance is just clinging onto your beliefs even though you've been proven wrong. So how could you possibly think logically if logic says that you are wrong, yet you continue to discredit it? So that try not to fall into that trap, because I don't know how to even deal with people that have been proven wrong, yet they still. I've had several arguments in economics about I'm like, well, this is what happens to prices when this thing, and they're like, no. I'm like, what are you talking about? No, I can graph it. I can show you. I can give you examples from history. They're like, I don't think so. I'm like, so that's always fun. All right, that's enough for today. Have a good afternoon. Don't forget to do your exit ticket, and I will see you guys later. And don't forget to mark this as done. A lot of people are turning in their exit ticket, but they're not marking it as complete. So make sure you guys go do that. All right, bye.